Chapter 5. Spiritistic Phenomena continued. I have thus far examined Mr. Savage's test case from a theoretical standpoint. My theories, however, have all been based upon the well-known facts of experimental psychology, except where I have argued from a provisional assumption of the reality of the power of independent clairvoyance. I now approach the domain of ascertained facts. My text is still his declaration that telepathy deals only with occurrences taking place at the time. If it had been stated that telepathy deals only with occurrences taking place at the time of the delivery of a message concerning them to the subjective mind of the party for whom it is intended, it would have been much nearer the truth, but would still have been far from accurate, as will be seen hereafter. Thus limited, however, it could not have been pressed into the service of Spiritism, and we must, therefore, presume that the words were intended and used in their full significance. In other words, the fate of the argument must depend upon the correctness of the premises as they are formulated. In making this statement, some very important facts set forth in Phantasms of the Living must have been forgotten for the moment, or else the article from which quotation was made was written before the publication of that voluminous record of telepathic experiences. Be that as it may, one very important feature of the phenomena of telepathy has certainly been ignored. It is a feature, too, of the first importance, for, without including it as a factor in any given case, one is more than likely to be led into the most grievous errors. I refer to the phenomenon of deferred percipience. The meaning of the term is thus explained by Mr. Myers in his learned and able introduction to Phantasms of the Living: we find in the case of phantasms corresponding to some accident or crisis which befalls a living friend, that there seems often to be a latent period before the phantasm becomes definitely externalized to the percipient's eye or ear. Sometimes a vague malaise seems first to be generated, and then when other stimuli are deadened, as at night or in some period of repose, the indefinite grief or uneasiness takes shape in the voice or figure of the friend who in fact passed through his moment of peril some hours before. He then goes on to say that it is quite possible that a deferment of this kind may sometimes intervene between the moment of death and the phantasmal announcement thereof to a distant friend. This is a very general, though a very accurate, statement of a principle which will presently be seen to be a corollary of the doctrine of duality of mind and of subconscious intelligence. A person in imminent and deadly peril telepathically conveys a message to his nearest friend or relative, informing him of the occurrence. This may be done by means of a vision or by clairaudience or otherwise, but it must necessarily be done by some means that addresses itself to the sensory experience of the percipient. It is a message from the subjective mind of the agent to that of the percipient. If the percipient is a psychic, he will probably perceive the import of the message at once. If he is not a psychic, or is not easily thrown into the psychical or subjective condition, he may not be able for hours to elevate the message above the threshold of his own consciousness. If he is incapable, as most people are, of becoming objectively conscious of what is going on in his subjective mind, he may never be able to become normally conscious of the message that is lying latent in his subliminal consciousness. Nevertheless, the information is there, although he may not, as before remarked, be conscious of it at the time of its reception. It may remain latent for a week or a month, or he may never be able to take objective cognizance of it unaided by someone more sensitive to subjective impressions. It must be remembered that telepathy is one of those psychic powers that is seldom, if ever, acquired by persons who are in a normal state of physical health. Let me not be misunderstood on this point. When we speak of one possessing telepathic power, we usually mean, simply, that he is one who is capable of taking objective cognizance or becoming objectively conscious of the messages received by his subjective mind. In other words, he is one who is capable of elevating the impressions of his subconscious intelligence above the threshold of his normal or objective consciousness. The fact that he is unable to do this is no evidence that he is incapable of receiving subjective impressions, or that he does not receive telepathic messages. Indeed, the facts show that there is practically little difference, other things being equal, in the capacity of persons of average intelligence for receiving telepathic communications. The difference consists not in the ability to receive, but in the ability to perceive, or to become objectively conscious of what has been received. And the latter power usually finds its origin in an abnormal physical condition, ranging in intensity from that of an incipient neurosis to the terrible affliction endured by the seeress of Provorst. The power and the physical abnormality nearly always sustaining perfectly harmonious proportional relations. It follows that a perfectly normal, healthy man is seldom able to assimilate the full content of a telepathic message. It reaches his consciousness, if at all, only in the form of a vague impression, creating a transient feeling of unrest or foreboding, but which is soon submerged or thrown off by his superabundant vitality. Few are entirely exempt from such impressions, and they vary in intensity in proportion to their importance to the individual. But the fact that one is not able to take objective cognizance of their full import does not prove that the information, in all its details, is not indelibly stamped upon the tablets of the soul. From this postulate it follows that the work of a trained psychic, capable of reading the minds of his sitters, is all that is necessary to reveal the full content of a telepathic message latent in the subjective mind of his client. The foregoing propositions seem almost self-evident to the merest tyro in psychic science, but as Mr. Myers and his colleagues, Messrs. Gurney and Podmore, have taken pains not only clearly to define deferred percipience and note it as an important factor in telepathy, but to demonstrate it experimentally in print accounts of its illustrative cases occurring spontaneously, it becomes our duty to present a few of the most prominent of those facts recorded by them, to the end that a most important factor in telepathy may not be in danger of being overlooked. The first case to which I invite attention was experimental. The facts seem trivial, but, as they illustrate an important principle, space cannot be refused for their reproduction. The author introduces the experiment by the following prefatory remarks. I will quote one more taste series, for the sake of illustrating a special point, namely, the deferment of the percipient's consciousness of the sensation until a time when the agent had himself ceased to feel it. This fact is of great interest, on account of the marked analogy to it which we shall encounter in many of the spontaneous telepathic cases. June 9th, 1885. Dr. Hyla Greaves was in contact with Miss Relf, having tasted salad oil. Miss Relf said, I feel a cool sensation in my mouth, something like that produced by Sal Purnell. Mr. R. C. Johnson in contact, having tasted Worcestershire sauce in another room. I taste something oily, it is very like salad oil. Then a few minutes after contact with Mr. Johnson had ceased, my mouth seems getting hot after the oil. N. B. Nothing at all had been said about the substances tasted either by Dr. Greaves or Mr. Johnson. Dr. Greaves in contact, having tasted bitter aloes. I taste something frightfully hot, something like vinegar and pepper. Is it Worcestershire sauce? Mr. Guthrie in contact, also having tasted bitter aloes. I taste something extremely bitter, but don't know what it is, and do not remember tasting it before. It is a very horrid taste. The next experimental case is also seemingly trivial, but is important as an illustration of deferred percipience. This experiment was one of a series made by Reverend P. H. Newnham, vicar of Maker, Devonport, England, his wife being the mind reader. The questions were written down by Mr. Newnham, the wife knowing nothing of their character, and the answers were written out by her by means of planchette. What name shall we give to our new dog? A. Yesterday was not a fair trial. Why was not yesterday a fair trial? A. Dog. And again, what do I mean by chaffing? C. About a lilac tree? A. Temper and imagination. You are thinking of somebody else. Please reply to my question. A. Lilacs. Here a single image or word seems to have made its mark on the percipient's mind, without calling any originative activity into play, and we thus get the naked reproduction. In these last examples, we again notice the feature of deferred impression. The influence only gradually became effective, the immediate answer being irrelevant to the question. We may suppose, therefore, that the first effect took place below the threshold of consciousness. To these remarks is added a footnote, as follows. The following case, though not strictly experimental, is sufficiently in point to be worth quoting. Though unfortunately not recorded in writing at the time, it was described within a few days of its occurrence to Mr. Podmore, who was acquainted with all the persons concerned. The narrator is Miss Robertson, of 229 Marylebone Road, W. About 3 years ago, I was speaking of planchette writing to some of my friends, when a young lady, a daughter of the house where I was spending the evening, mentioned that she had played with planchette at school, and that it had always written for her. Thereupon I asked her to spend the evening with me, and try it again, which she agreed to do. On the morning of the day on which she had arranged to come to me, her brother, on leaving the house, said, laughing, "Well, Edith, it is all humbug, but if Planchette tells you the name and sum of money which are on a check which I have in my pocket, and which I am going to cash for Mother, I will believe there is something in it." Edith, on her arrival at my house in the evening, told me of this, and I said, "We must not expect that. Planchette never does what one wants," or words to that effect. A couple of hours after, we tried the planchette, Edith's hand alone touching it. It almost immediately wrote, quite clearly, I. Spaulding, 613. 4. I had forgotten about the check, and I said, "What can that mean?" Upon which Edith replied, "It is HS check." I was incredulous, having a long acquaintance with Planchette. I said, "If it is right, send me word directly you get home. I am sure it will not be." But the next day I received a letter from Edith, telling me that she had astonished her brother greatly by telling him the name and amount on the check, which was perfectly correct. I have read this account to the young lady and her brother, who sign it as well as myself. Nora Robertson, E. C. D. C. H. C. In answer to an inquiry, Miss Robertson adds, on February 12, 1885, Miss E. C. says, in answer to your question, that she is quite certain she could not have known or surmised the name and amount of the check. I can confirm her on the first point, for I remember questioning everybody all round at the time. She had just returned from school and knew nothing at all about her mother's business or money matters. Here, it will be observed, the impression seems not only to have been unconscious, but to have remained latent for several hours before taking effect, for it is, at any rate, the most natural supposition that the transference actually occurred at the time when the conversation on the subject took place between the brother and sister. The intelligent reader will not fail to notice that the foregoing is not only illustrative of deferred percipience, but is representative of a very large class of cases where the message never reaches the normal consciousness of the percipient except through extraneous means. In this case it was by planchette, in the hands of the percipient. But does anyone suppose that if someone else had operated the instrument, who was also a good telepathist and in rapport with Edith, the same result would not have been produced? For instance, suppose Miss Robertson had been thus endowed, would it have been necessary to attribute the phenomenon to supramundane agency if she had succeeded in reading in Edith's subjective mind what was obviously there, namely, the details regarding the check? Certainly not. And yet that would have been a case exactly such as Messrs. Savage and Myers have declared unaccountable except under the hypothesis of spirit communion. The next case of deferred percipience recorded in Phantasms of the Living was related by the percipient, Mr. Frederick Wingfield, of France. The essential part of the narrative is the following. On the night of Thursday, the 25th of March 1880, I retired to bed after reading till late, as is my habit. I dreamed that I was lying on my sofa reading, when, on looking up, I saw distinctly the figure of my brother, Richard Wingfield Baker, sitting on the chair before me. I dreamed that I spoke to him, but that he simply bent his head in reply, rose, and left the room. When I awoke, I found myself standing with one foot on the ground by my bedside, and the other on the bed, trying to speak and to pronounce my brother's name. So strong was the impression as to the reality of his presence, and so vivid the whole scene as dreamt, that I left my bedroom to search for my brother in the sitting room. I examined the chair where I had seen him seated. I returned to bed, tried to fall asleep in the hope of a repetition of the appearance, but my mind was too excited, too painfully disturbed, as I recalled what I had dreamed. I must have, however, fallen asleep towards the morning, but when I awoke, the impression of my dream was as vivid as ever, and I may add as to this very hour equally strong and clear. My sense of impending evil was so strong that I at once made a note in my memorandum book of this appearance and added the words, "God forbid." 3 days afterwards I received the news that my brother, Richard Wingfield Baker, had died on Thursday evening, the 7/25th of March 1880, at 8:30 p.m. from the effects of the terrible injuries received in a fall while hunting with the Blackmore Vale hounds. Following this case, and the corroborative evidence verifying it, may be found the following very sensible and judicious remarks. It will be seen here that the impression followed the death by a few hours, a feature which will frequently recur. The italics are mine. The fact, of course, slightly detracts from the evidential force of a case, as compared with the completely simultaneous coincidences. Inasmuch as the odds against the accidental occurrence of a unique impression of someone's presence within a few hours of his death, enormous as they are less enormous than the odds against a similar accidental occurrence within 5 minutes of the death. But the deferment of the impression, though to this slight extent affecting a case as an item of telepathic evidence, is not in itself any obstacle to the telepathic explanation. We may recall that in some of the experimental cases the impression was never a piece of conscious experience at all, while in others the latency and gradual emergence of the idea was a very noticeable feature. This justifies us in presuming that an impression which ultimately takes a sensory form may fail in the first instance to reach the threshold of attention. It may be unable to compete, at the moment, with the vivid sensory impressions and the crowd of ideas and images that belong to normal seasons of waking life, and it may thus remain latent till darkness and quiet give a chance for its development. This view seems, at any rate, supported by the fact that it is usually at night that the delayed impression, if such it be, emerges into the percipient's consciousness. It is supported also by analogies which recognized psychology supplies. I may refer to the extraordinary exaltation of memory sometimes observed in hypnotic and hysteroepileptic subjects, or even to the vivid revival, in ordinary dreaming, of impressions which have hardly affected the waking consciousness. The next and last case for which room can be made is from a narrative related by a Mrs. Montgomery to the author of Phantasms of the Living, February 1884. Nearly 30 years ago, I lost a sister. The place where she died being at some distance, my husband went to the funeral without me. I went to bed early and had a frightful dream of the funeral ceremony. I saw my brother faint away at the service and fall into the grave. I awoke with the horror of the dream, just as my husband entered the room on his return from the funeral, which had taken place at least 8 hours before. I asked him to tell me if anything unusual had happened, as I had had a terrible dream, and I related it. He said, "Who in the world told you that?" "I never intended telling you." I said, "I only dreamt it. Just as you were coming in, I awoke." To this the author appends the following remarks. Here the picture transferred to the percipient's dream was a precise and detailed one. It was of a sort which might at first seem more fitly to belong to a later class, where something of the nature of clairvoyance is suggested. Nor would the 8 hours interval between the event and the dream be an objection to this view, for I have already mentioned that the deferment or latency of telepathic impressions is especially frequent in dream and borderland cases, as though the idea or image had been unable to compete with the vivid sensations which external realities force on the mind, and only got its chance of emerging into consciousness when the senses were closed to these contending influences. But seeing that at the moment of Mrs. Montgomery's dream her husband was just about to enter her room, with the shock of the burial scene probably fresh in his mind, it is at any rate conceivable that he then, and not the brother at the earlier time, transmitted the impression. It may be here remarked that, if the author's interpretation of this occurrence is the true one, it demonstrates not only that Mr. Savage's postulate, that telepathy deals only with occurrences taking place at the time, is conspicuously inexact, but that the person whom the occurrence most concerns is not necessarily the agent who transmits the intelligence. Even a clergyman may be prepared to relegate the second chapter of Daniel to the domain of romance, but the story is highly probable, as well as illustrative of the phenomenon of deferred percipience. Nebuchadnezzar's dream was strongly impressed upon his mind as being very important, yet he was not able to recall it to his objective mind. He demanded its recall by the magi of all classes, and upon their failure to do so he decreed their death. Daniel and his 3 friends were included in the despotic decree. The 4 met and prayed over it, death staring them in the face. Prayer and the imminence of death put them in the best possible subjective condition, and when this was supplemented by sleep, Daniel was in telepathic communication with the king, and, after the dream was at least 24 hours old, read it from the king's mind, which was its sole repository. The dream and the percipience were not concurrent, yet a clearer case of telepathy is nowhere stated. I have now presented an outline of the most important factors in telepathy that seem to have been ignored by both Mr. Myers and Mr. Savage, and it remains to apply them to the case under consideration. The reader will readily recall the salient features of Mr. Savage's test case as given in full in Chapter 3. The one fact necessary to account for, or rather, the one problem necessary to solve, is how could the details concerning the manner of the lady's death have been transmitted telepathically to the psychic who first informed the living that the victim was not drowned, but had been killed by a blow on the head? It seems to me that there are two solutions of the problem, either one of which is adequate. The first and most obvious one, in view of the facts pertaining to the phenomenon of deferred percipience, which have just been detailed, is this. It will be remembered that the victim of the tragedy, Mrs. K., and her sister, Mrs. B., had both been interested in psychic investigation and had held sittings with the psychic, Mrs. E., the one who subsequently revealed the details of the tragedy at a sitting in presence of the son and the sister of the deceased. It will also be remembered that, again quoting the language of Mr. Savage, this Mrs. E., the psychic, had been known to all the parties concerned for many years and was held in the highest respect. It is also stated in the same paragraph that the psychic visited Mrs. B. regularly every Monday, and that on the occasion of these visits the three ladies would frequently have a sitting. Here, then, was the situation. The psychic and the deceased had not only been on the most intimate and friendly terms for many years, but they frequently had a sitting for psychic investigation. Could a state of affairs be imagined that would make it more probable that the deceased would telepathically inform the psychic of the great crisis through which she was passing? Could conditions be imagined more favorable to the successful transmission of a telepathic message to a psychic? Surely not. But it appears that the psychic did not become cognizant of the facts until the sitting on Monday. It is superfluous to say that it was simply a case of deferred percipience. The psychic did not happen to be in the subjective condition until the Monday's sitting, and consequently was not able to elevate the message above the threshold of her consciousness. Could anything be more obviously within the recognized domain of telepathy? Yet here is a case where telepathy was dealing with occurrences not taking place at the time. Here is a communication of intelligence that neither the psychic nor the sitter possessed, nor ever did possess. I am not yet through with the telepathic explanations of this case, but have reserved the better one for the last. It may not be better for this particular case, but it will cover a larger number of other cases coming under the test conditions prescribed than the one just given. For the first explanation will not cover cases where the agent is not presumably in telepathic rapport with the psychic, a condition obviously existent in this case. The solution I am now about to advance will not only cover this case, but will explain all that I have ever seen, heard, or read of, coming under the test formulas I have so often quoted. The reader will have already anticipated me when I say that the most obviously natural thing imaginable was for the dying mother to send a telepathic message to her son, informing him of all the sad details of her death, possibly including the incidents of the Friday previous, although we are not bound to include the latter, for the reason that they could have been obtained from the survivors. The son was not a psychic, and consequently could not readily become conscious of the content of the subjective message. It was therefore necessarily a case of deferred percipience, and he might never have become objectively conscious of the information which he subjectively possessed had he not consulted a psychic who could read his mind. He had that information latent in his subjective mind, and it was necessarily an open book to the psychic. If not, why not? As I have before remarked, the only possible alternative is to deny the proposition that information obtained telepathic ally can be transmitted telepathically. Again I ask, if not, why not? Here, then, is the issue clearly defined, reduced to its lowest terms, and divested of all extraneous, irrelevant side issues. It is the last ditch of Spiritism considered as a scientific question. The proposition is that if A can communicate a fact by means of telepathy to B, it follows that B can communicate the same fact by the same means to C. To admit this proposition to be true is to yield the last stronghold of Spiritism. To deny it is equivalent to affirming that telepathy can be employed only to convey information received by some other means. Is there any reason to suppose that telepathy is so restricted in its field of operations? Why should it be restricted to any two individuals in a group of three or more? As well might one say that the power of gravity is restricted to two of the heavenly bodies, and that because it operates between the sun and the earth it cannot operate between the sun and any other planet. As well might one assume that the moon does not shine upon the earth, since it is known that the moon derives its light from the sun. The logical consequences of these two suppositions would be no more disastrous to the planetary universe than it is to the mental world to suppose that B cannot telepath to C because A can telepath to B. In the one case, it leads to planetary chaos. In the other, it leads directly and inevitably into the dark and dismal realm of superstition. Knowledge of a fact obtained by means of telepathy is just as much a part of the recipient's stock of subjective information as knowledge of the same fact obtained in any other way. This being true, it is a corollary that the knowledge of that fact can be telepathically communicated to another person without reference to the method by which, or to the source from which, it was received. The last resource of Spiritism is to deny the truth of this proposition. Well may Spiritists hesitate to admit its truth, for it is evident to them, as it is to every logical mind, that when once it is admitted that information telepathically received from one person can be telepathically communicated to another, it involves the admission that the same information may be transmitted by the same means to still another, and so on, ad infinitum. It is as obvious to them as it is to others, therefore, that, when once the admission is made, there exists a ready means of accounting for every conceivable case of alleged spirit communication. Let us put the issue in another form. Let us suppose that A has recently died. His mother, B, is not a psychic and knows nothing, objectively, of the death of her son, but happens soon after to consult a medium, C, who knows, objectively, nothing of either A or B. Then suppose that C informs B that A is dead, adding particulars, which, if true, demonstrate positive knowledge, and it is subsequently found that the information is accurate. Now, one of the two following conclusions must necessarily be the true one. 1. The first is that A, while he was yet living, telepathically communicated the facts to his mother, B, and she, unconsciously receiving the message, telepathically communicated it to C. 2. The second is that the spirit of the dead A communicated the facts directly to C, admitting telepathy to be a power of the human mind, and admitting the phenomenon of deferred percipience. The great question is, which of the foregoing explanations must science accept as the true one? This is the crucial question of Mr. Savage. Here is his Rubicon 2, which marks the boundary between the two worlds. Unlike the historical Rubicon, upon the banks of which Imperial Caesar paused, it is both wide and deep, but they find a parallel only in the tremendous responsibilities assumed in venturing to cross. The supposed case is identical with the residuary phenomena, which Mr. Myers and Mr. Savage agree in attributing to spirits of the dead. I protest that I am unable to follow them. I do not know of any rule of logic or science which will warrant me in attributing to supramundane agency any phenomenon which can be explained by reference to known principles of natural law. Nor do I know of any rule which would warrant me in presuming a supramundane cause for a phenomenon when even cognate phenomena are explicable under principles of natural law. Let us for a moment contemplate this scientific attitude which these gentlemen have assumed. It is elementary to say that no hypothesis can be true unless it is capable of explaining all the phenomena pertaining to the subject matter. In other words, if one single pertinent fact is inexplicable under an hypothesis, that hypothesis is necessarily wrong. Yet these gentlemen are attempting to base an hypothesis upon a small residuum of phenomena, whilst admitting that the vast bulk of cognate phenomena are explicable under well-known principles of natural law. Now, one of the primary rules of scientific investigation is that when a series of phenomena has been attributed to supramundane agency, if one of that series can be shown to have been produced by mundane causes, all the rest of the series must be presumed to have the same origin until the contrary is demonstrated. Under this rule, no true scientist or logician has a right, for one moment, to consider the spiritistic hypothesis as tenable after it has been demonstrated that one alleged spirit communication is the result of telepathic communion between the minds of living persons. Perhaps it would be asking too much to insist that the average advocate of Spiritism should be governed by the letter of this harsh rule. But I do protest, in the name of outraged science, against all attempts to base an hypothesis upon a small residuum of phenomena. Primitive man held that thunder was the voice of an angry god. Science demonstrates that it is caused by electricity passing between two clouds, or between a cloud and the earth. Every schoolboy now knows, when he sees a flash of lightning, that electricity is seeking an equilibrium and that he may expect to hear thunder. He knows, too, when he hears a peal of thunder, that a flash of lightning has preceded it, although he may not have observed the lightning. It would cause some surprise to hear a modern scientist, trained to habits of close observation, strict analysis, and logical classification of phenomena, who, having once heard a peal of thunder and failed to observe the flash of lightning that preceded it. I say it would cause some surprise to hear such a man calmly observe that thunder is divided into three classes. The first is the result of electricity passing between clouds. The second is the result of electricity passing between the clouds and the earth. These comprise the vast bulk of the phenomena, but there is a still smaller residuum of thunder which cannot be thus accounted for and must be held to be the voice of an angry God. Yet this is precisely parallel to the attitude assumed by Mr. Myers in regard to alleged spirit communications. He divides them into three classes and admits that the vast bulk of them can easily be explained either by reference to previous knowledge possessed by the psychic or to that obtained by him through the medium of telepathy. But when he finds a case where the source of the telepathic message is not entirely obvious to his mind, he forgets his scientific training and boldly crosses the Rubicon which marks the boundary between the realms of science and superstition. Again, Mr. Savage, in effect, says that it stretches the theory of telepathy beyond probability to suppose it possible for a message received telepathically to be transmitted to another by the same means. I have read somewhere of a scientist of a certain school who said that he could very well understand that the apple which Newton is popularly supposed to have observed as it fell to the ground may have been influenced by gravity when it performed that historic feat. He was also ready to admit that the Earth directly as to the mass and inversely as to the square of the distance moved to meet the apple, as that would not require the Earth to move very far. And consequently it was not very much of a concession, anyway, but he thought it was stretching the theory of gravitation a little too far to suppose it to be capable of reaching out into the space and influencing the sun, moon, and stars. He was one of that numerous class who were constantly descanting upon the simplicity of nature's laws, and yet he preferred to believe that each planet was held in its course by a miracle. He has many followers today who hold that it is much easier, and therefore more in accordance with the simplicity of the operations of nature, to attribute spiritistic phenomena directly to spirits of the dead than to attempt to account for them by the complicated theory of telepathy. True, it is easier and simpler. It saves thinking. It was also easier and simpler to suppose that the Earth was flat. It complicated matters very decidedly when it was discovered that it is round, and still more when it was found that it is not the center of the universe, but only an infinitesimal part of the stupendous whole. There is a constant tendency in the popular mind to confound simplicity of formula with simplicity of operation. The former is generally simple to the last degree. The latter is infinitely complicated. Thus, nothing could be simpler than the formulas expressing the three laws of Kepler. But what a vast and complicated system they represent. A single instance will illustrate my meaning. Nothing could exceed in simplicity his statement that the planets move in ellipses, having the sun in one focus. The old astronomers, ever in search of simplicity, conceived the notion that the planets must move in perfect circles around the sun. But Tycho Brahe's accurate observations, seconded by Kepler's genius for generalization, developed the fact that the planets move in curves of the extremest possible complexity. This contrast between the simplicity of a formula and the complexity of its application is observable in all of nature's operations. It is true in mechanics, as shown, for instance, in the formula defining the power of the lever. That formula is so simple that a child can grasp its fundamental significance. Yet in every complicated machine its powers are developed and utilized, with its various modifications, in 1,000 different places and directions. And in all animated nature it is utilized in such an infinity of complexities as to defy analysis. This contrast is as true in the realm of psychology as it is elsewhere. The underscore formulas expressive of the greatest truths are always simple. They can be comprehended in their fundamental significance by the most ordinary intelligence. But a lifetime of study will fail to discover the infinite complications involved in their practical operations. Simplicity of operation, therefore, is not a test of scientific truth. That notion belongs to the primitive ages of scientific investigation. On the contrary, every new discovery of a natural law reveals an infinity of unexpected complications in the operations of the forces of nature. Nor is simplicity of statement a sure criterion of truth, although its opposite always renders a proposition open to suspicion. It is obvious that an error can be formulated in as simple terms as a truth. Thus, when we are told that a psychic phenomenon is produced by disembodied spirits, and are gravely informed that this explanation is the simplest, and therefore more in accordance with the simplicity of nature's laws than is a complicated, telepathic explanation involving the exercise of that power by at least 3 individuals, the statement does not carry conviction to the scientific mind, simple as the explanation may be. The Spiritistic explanation does not explain. It merely gets rid of the question by thrusting it outside the domain of science, outside the region of ascertained facts and the known laws of the human mind. This attitude is all the more remarkable in a scientist when we consider the fact that in abandoning the realm of demonstrated laws he plunges into a region of which nothing is definitely known, into an hypothetical world, peopled by hypothetical spirits. And it is still more remarkable when we reflect that the only fact upon which he could possibly base a claim to a logical right to enter the unknown world for an explanation is the very fact in dispute. He does not even claim to have any fact or class of facts upon which to base his hypothesis of spirit communion other than the very ones in controversy. His attitude, therefore, is this: a phenomenon is to be accounted for. On the one hand, it is claimed that it is explicable by the well-known facts of telepathy. On the other hand, Messrs. Savage and Myers say, no, we do not know how to explain it by telepathy. It must, therefore, be spirits of the dead. If asked what facts they have in support of the Spiritistic theory, their reply is, the fact that it cannot be explained by telepathy. How do you know that it cannot be explained by telepathy? Because the phenomenon was produced by spirits. In other words, such scientists reason in a circle, and their hypothesis is unsupported by anything save their bare, bald assertion that a small residuum of phenomena proceeds from disembodied spirits. It may be replied that my theory rests upon the mere assertion that the phenomena are explicable by reference to telepathy. This, however, cannot reasonably be said, for my theory is in direct line with the well-known and admitted facts of telepathy, whilst theirs implies an utter abandonment of the domain of demonstrable facts. My theory is wholly within the logical limits of scientific induction, whilst theirs implies a bold leap into the realm of superstition. The question is often asked, if 2 embodied spirits can communicate with each other by means of telepathy, why cannot a disembodied spirit communicate with one still in the flesh by the same means? My answer is, I do not know. Nor do I know of anyone who does know. I submit, however, that it is not a pertinent question, for, be the facts as they may, it is obvious that no one can tell why disembodied spirits can or cannot communicate with the living. The real and only pertinent question is, do disembodied spirits communicate with the living? The answer to this question must be made by each individual for himself, and the character of the answer will depend upon the evidence before him and his capacity for estimating its value. My own answer has already been given in the preceding pages and more fully elsewhere. That answer is that there is no valid scientific evidence whatever that spirits of the dead have ever communicated in any manner with living persons. In investigating this question, I have been influenced solely by a desire to learn the truth, and in coming to this conclusion, I have been guided by the rules and axioms of logical, scientific investigation as I understand them. Amongst the latter, I have found none more worthy of confidence than those set forth by Mr. Myers in his admirable introduction to Phantasms of the Living. One sentence of that essay should be stamped upon the memory of every investigator of psychic science. It is this: we must not rashly multiply the problems involved in this difficult inquiry. This declaration refers to the very question now under consideration, namely, whether any part of the phenomena of supersensory transference of thoughts or messages are produced by spirits of the dead. Continuing, Mr. Myers says, it is certainly safer to inquire how far they can be explained by the influences or impressions, which, as we know by actual experiment, living persons can under certain circumstances exert or affect on one another, in those obscure supersensory modes which we have provisionally massed together under the title of telepathy. This is Mr. Myers the scientist. Mr. Myers the spiritist has, nevertheless, rashly multiplied the problems involved in this difficult inquiry by ascribing a part of the phenomena to disembodied spirits. I have therefore appealed from Mr. Myers the spiritist to Mr. Myers the scientist, with what success I leave our readers to judge. I have stated all I deem it necessary to say in regard to Spiritism, considered as an alleged means of communicating with disembodied spirits. I have confined my remarks to the residuary phenomena, which embrace all that remains to be accounted for, according to the deliberate admissions of two of the ablest scientific advocates of Spiritism now living. I do not expect other Spiritists to be bound by their admissions, for other Spiritists are satisfied with a far inferior grade and weight of evidence than they are. Indeed, I know of no one in the ranks of Spiritism who is so careful as they are in weighing the value of evidence for or against the Spiritistic hypothesis. Nor do I know of any whose qualitative and quantitative analysis of Spiritistic phenomena has left a smaller residuum of facts upon which to base the hypothesis of spirit communication. The scientific world will never cease to be grateful to them for the painstaking care which they have exercised in eliminating the vast bulk of the phenomena which have been attributed to supramundane agency. And if I have succeeded in reducing them to a still smaller residuum, I shall beg the privilege of quietly basking in the reflected glory of their achievements. Happy face T. As I remarked at the opening of this discussion, I have felt compelled to treat the subject of Spiritism at some length, for the reason that it is always of the first importance that the basic facts under consideration in any scientific investigation should be properly classified. The gentlemen whose views I have criticized will be the first to endorse this proposition. Moreover, each of us is in pursuit of the same ultimate object, namely, a scientific demonstration of a future life. The broad line of difference in our methods of reasoning up to that conclusion may be summed up briefly as follows. My proposition is that psychic phenomena, properly interpreted, including that which they attribute to disembodied spirits, furnish indubitable evidence of a future life, and that the only interpretation which science can give to such phenomena is that it emanates from the living psychic, and never from disembodied spirits. They hold that psychic phenomena, of the so-called spiritistic variety, are valuable as evidence of a future life only on the supposition that they, or some of them at least, emanate directly from disembodied spirits, and that a demonstration that disembodied spirits can communicate with the living constitutes a demonstration that there is a future life for mankind. I hold that so-called spiritistic phenomena are valuable as evidence of a future life only on the supposition that none of them emanate from disembodied spirits. My reasons are briefly these. In the first place, two antagonistic hypotheses cannot both be correct, nor can each be partly true and partly false, for any hypothesis that does not explain all the facts is necessarily wrong, and therefore utterly valueless. Thus, if any one of a series of so-called spiritistic phenomena can be demonstrated to emanate from disembodied spirits, the telepathic hypothesis is necessarily invalid as a solvent for that series of phenomena. On the other hand, if one of said series can be demonstrated to be referable to telepathy between living persons, the spiritistic hypothesis is necessarily wrong. In other words, it is a logical necessity that, as between two antagonistic hypotheses, one or the other must be wholly right and the other wholly wrong, or both must be wholly wrong. The nature of the case does not admit of compromise, for principles of natural law are not established by majorities of facts, nor are there exceptions in the operation of natural laws. It follows that if one psychic phenomenon could be scientifically demonstrated to have been produced by disembodied spirits, the whole subject would be relegated to logical chaos, and some solution of the mystery would have to be sought for other than that embraced in either of the hypotheses under consideration. Moreover, if all the phenomena which have been ascribed to supramundane agency could be demonstrated to proceed from disembodied spirits, the problem of a future life would be not a whit nearer to a solution than it was when Job propounded his momentous question, for the question of spirit identity would still arise to plague the faithful. It will not be denied that the question of spirit identity is, and ever has been, the one great problem which defies solution. Nor will it be denied that, if it is true that spirits do communicate with the living, there is indubitable evidence that there are evil spirits as well as good, that there are ignorant spirits as well as enlightened, that there are spirits of health, as well as goblins damned, and that their intents are sometimes wicked and sometimes charitable. If, Therefore, we are forced to accept alleged spirit communications as genuine emanations from disembodied spirits. It by no manner of means follows that one of them comes from a spirit who has once been incarnated. And the problem of a future life for man is just as far from a solution as it was before kitchen furniture began to testify and hysterical women to teach the science of the soul.